Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Dalia Gebrial, and I'm really delighted to be joined by Micha Frazer-Carroll. Micha, how are you doing?
I'm good, apart from the fact that I'm boiling hot. How are you, Dalia?
Yeah, it's pretty hot under these lights. I have a little fan here, so if I'm like giving Beyonce J-Lo, it's by design. Coming up tonight, Israel's plan to bury the Palestinian state is revealed. Grenadian government drops its oath of allegiance to King Charles. Tucker Carlson's fascinating interview with Agapia Stephanopoulos, and Al Jazeera executive producer Laila Al-Arain talks on the impact of their journalists being killed. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Calling it Zionism at its best, Israel's far-right Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich has today approved a plan to build 3,500 new homes in a West Bank settlement. And he described the scheme to export thousands more Israelis into Palestinian land as one that, quote, buries the idea of a Palestinian state.
Whoever in the world is trying to recognize a Palestinian state today will receive our answer on the ground. Not with documents, nor with decisions or statements, but with facts. Facts of houses, facts of neighborhoods, roads, and of more and more Jewish families building lives. They will speak of the false Palestinian dream. We will continue to build a fulfilling Jewish reality. This reality definitively buries the idea of a Palestinian state simply because there is nothing to recognize and no one to recognize. On this important day, I call from here on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The time has come to fully apply Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, to forever remove from the table the idea of dividing the land, and to make sure that by September, Europe's hypocrite leaders will simply have nothing to recognize.
Now, lots of people clutching their pearls in response to that, because it kind of breaks one of the sort of smoke and mirrors that has defined the geopolitics of the region over the past, let's say, 40 years minimum to 70 years overall. Which is this idea that there were sincere attempts to work towards a two-state solution. And that is something that these European states, US states who have continually used this as a shield to deflect criticism is now dead in the water. And the reason that we have gotten to the point where an Israeli minister can come out and clearly say there will never be a Palestinian state, that is the goal, is because the Israelis have been progressively enabled to build illegal settlements that make a Palestinian state essentially non-viable, even if there was political will, which there is none. So I really hope that I am not going to see hand-wringing and moralizing from the very nation states that have enabled us to get to this point, now that Smotrich is merely completing the sentence that they started and they were complicit in starting. As for this moment now, the Israeli invaders will be taking up house in the E1 settlement project between Jerusalem and Ma'ale-Adumim. And they'll be doing so with the full backing of the US President Donald Trump's administration, according to Smotrich. Calling Trump and the US ambassador to Israel, quote, men of truth with a clear, distinct moral voice that is not confused by the hypocrisy of the West, unquote. The minister went on to say they understood that, quote, a Palestinian state would endanger the existence of Israel. And he described the West Bank as, quote, an inseparable part of our land, the one that God promised to our father Abraham and gave to us thousands of years ago. The new E1 settlement is of deep strategic interest to both Israel and Palestine. The E1 settlement plan is one that has lain dormant in recent years. It's an area that juts from the eastern border of East Jerusalem, which, if settled, would unite several illegal Israeli settlements, including Ma'ale-Adumim, And Palestinians say the intention in settling there is to create a crescent of stolen Israeli territory that disconnects Palestine's East Jerusalem from the West Bank, preventing any eastwards expansion of East Jerusalem. It would also effectively cut the West Bank in two, making a connected Palestinian state even more difficult. Ma'ale Adumim, which abuts the E1 area, is an illegal settlement in the West Bank, about 4 miles east of Jerusalem and built on land stolen from at least 4 different Palestinian villages. It has a population of little under 40,000 settlers, meaning an additional 3,500 settlers marks a 10% increase. The Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has responded to the plan by calling for genuine international intervention and sanctions to halt the plan and has called on the wider world to end the genocide, displacement and annexation. In other words, please uphold your own international laws, which is not something we've seen any Western governments prepared to do in any meaningful way. The latest move from Israel comes in the context of increasing violence in the West Bank. The New York Times reports that Israeli settler attacks have reached an all-time high, with arson and land grabs amongst the many ways Israelis are carrying out the most violent campaigns against Palestinian villages since UN records began. This is from that article. Settlers carried out more than 750 attacks on Palestinians and their property during the first half of this year, an average of nearly 130 assaults a month, according to records compiled by the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. That is the highest monthly average since the UN started compiling such records in 2006. Around 700,000 Jewish Israelis live on Palestinian land in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And while Israel continues to persecute, rob and assault Palestinians in a slow-motion genocide designed to bring about the so-called Greater Israel, in Gaza there are no breaks. As Palestinian children fade away from hunger, with at least 106 now dead from starvation, more than 100 aid agencies have accused Israel of weaponizing aid by introducing restrictive rules that prevent them from delivering it into the Strip. And that's not just food aid, of course, it's medical aid too, meaning doctors continue to struggle to help the victims of Israel's ongoing assault on the Strip, including hundreds of burned and broken kids. And yet, you can't display a simple message being against all of this without triggering Zionists around the world. Football organisation UEFA unveiled this message on pitch ahead of the Super Cup final between Tottenham and Paris Saint-Germain last night. It says simply, stop killing children, stop killing civilians. Pretty mild message, pretty much the most mild message you can imagine, with not even a mention of who's doing the killing and who's doing the starving. And yet, a guilty conscience will always reveal itself. This was from journalist Stephen Pollard. UEFA's statement on the pitch for Super Cup, they might as well have gone the whole way and written, "Fuck you, Jews." That is a deeply anti-Semitic thing to say, to conflate the beliefs of Jewish people all around the world with a rogue state, with a state that is committing one of the most abhorrent humanitarian crises in living memory the world has ever seen. The idea that this is something that implicates Jewish people all around the world is not only anti-Semitic, but it makes Jewish people less safe all around the world. And that is what many anti-Zionist Jews have been saying for a very long time. Micha, how have we gotten to a position where the idea of stop killing children, stop killing civilians has become controversial?
Yeah, I think we've really gotten to a point in the political discourse where it feels like things have become so warped, and as if certain things are seen as dog whistles or saying certain things when it's extremely far from that. And I agree with you, the idea that this could be seen as a statement against Jewish people is completely anti-Semitic and doesn't make any sense. I think that also this story kind of really got me thinking about the kind of futility of this idea of impartiality and the idea of trying to, in, for example, institutions like UEFA, trying to be impartial and not make political statements. I kind of got into a bit of a rabbit hole at looking at their kind of rules around political messages. And, you know, there's this rule that says that they shouldn't make any political statements before, during, or after matches. But we are in a situation in which the context is political. The killing of Palestinian footballers is also political. And whether it's kind of not saying anything or saying something, this is a political situation. And so I was really glad to see that UEFA made this statement, but simultaneously, I think that not naming Israel as the perpetrator was a political choice too.
Yeah, and we'll come on to this in one of our later segments when we discuss in more depth the murdering of Palestinian journalists by Israel. And it also does get me thinking about this idea of impartiality, of objectivity, neutrality. Obviously, these words aren't exactly the same, but they are evoked in similar ways. And it just doesn't make sense when you're talking about a situation where one side has literally all the power and the other side is virtually powerless. It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't have the aesthetics that we would associate with neutrality, that people try to associate with neutrality. In that context, saying nothing is aiding and abetting what we are all seeing with our own eyes. And so it's kind of impossible to avoid being political in a context like this, because as you said, Micha, to not bear witness, to act as if nothing is going on, to act as if nothing is happening, is to act as if Palestinian lives in the Gaza Strip are meaningless, which is part and parcel of the political moment that we are in. The Grenadian government has announced it will no longer swear allegiance to King Charles. The move comes amidst growing calls to remove the monarch as head of state. The constitutional amendment was agreed by both the governing and opposition parties on Emancipation Day, which is the anniversary of slavery being abolished in the British Empire. Grenada's Prime Minister Dickon Mitchell made the following statement. The unanimous support for this amendment demonstrates our shared commitment to national identity and constitutional progress. And while we may differ on many issues, today we stand together in affirming that our allegiance belongs to Grenada and its people. I don't think anyone in their right mind will expect me or any future Prime Minister of Grenada, on taking the oath of office to serve them, that I should be swearing allegiance to King Charles, his heirs and successors. What is it about King Charles that is superior to me, that requires me not to swear allegiance to the people of Grenada, but to him? Calls throughout Caribbean nations have been mounting in the past several years to fragment its remaining ties with the British state. Barbados removed then Queen Elizabeth as head of state in 2021, becoming a republic. And in December 2024, Jamaica tabled a bill to remove King Charles. Recent visits by the British monarch to the islands have been steeped in controversy. William and Kate's 2022 visit to Jamaica was overshadowed by protests and arguments for reparations and independence, like this one.
It is an insult to us for these young people to be here to try to persuade us to keep the status quo in place when our goal is to loosen and remove the gloved hands of the Queen from around our necks so that we can breathe.
Here's another clip from that trip featuring a fairly awkward press conference between the Prince and Jamaican Prime Minister Andrew Holmes.
Jamaica is a very free and liberal country, and the people are very expressive, and I'm certain that you would have seen the spectrum of expressions yesterday. There are issues here which are, as you would know, unresolved, but your presence gives an opportunity for those issues to be placed in context, put front and center, and to be addressed in as best as we can. But Jamaica is, as you would see, a country that is very proud of our history, very proud of what we have achieved, and we are moving on. And we intend to attain in short order our development goals and fulfill our true ambitions and destiny as an independent, developed, prosperous country.
Earlier today, I was joined by Professor Gus John, a Grenadian-born writer, academic and activist. I began by asking him what prompted the decision to remove the oath of allegiance at this particular moment.
For a number of reasons. One is that the Grenada reparations movement has been gathering steam, and there are some very, very vocal campaigners there within a government-sponsored reparations agency. That's one reason. The other reason is that Grenada has been working with other Caribbean nations to try and accelerate the unification of the Caribbean with Africa as part of the African Union's Sixth Region initiative, right? That's been going on for a while. I've been associated with it since 2005. And I think there are some, certainly colleagues, comrades in Grenada, who are of the view that with the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, there should have been a change, a recalibration of the relationship between Britain and that region.
I mean, perhaps you can explain to us what characterizes that relationship now. I mean, obviously, during Empire, Britain was entirely dependent on the Caribbean for resources, for labor in different iterations. So since independence, what has that relationship looked like? How would you characterize that relationship between Britain and Grenada, but also the Caribbean more broadly?
It's an anachronistic relationship. And when I say anachronistic, what I mean is it has all the trappings of the residue of empire, but none of the gains, certainly not as far as those Caribbean nations are concerned. And frankly, since 1972, when Britain joined the European club and divested itself of responsibility for supporting the economies of that region, those regional heads should have stated boldly that they needed no more of this Commonwealth business with the Queen as its head. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it is only recently that Mia Mottley in Barbados started the debate about a republic in Barbados. Since then, the discourse about republicanism and breaking with the British monarchy has accentuated people's interest in the matter. In, for example, Jamaica, and so I think, although Grenada isn't as far as I know, intending to become a republic anytime soon, they thought it was time to renounce or rather disavow themselves from this oath of allegiance to the monarch of England.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of push on that because obviously Grenada has removed the oath, but it's still not a republic. We have Barbados has become a republic. Jamaica have tabled to become a republic. Why have Grenada not taken the same, why has Grenada not taken the same step? And what would materially change if it did become a republic in the way that Barbados has?
It seems to me that would have been an obvious thing to do. Because if you say you're not going to take the oath of allegiance to the British king, and your allegiance is going to be your own to your own nation and its sovereignty, then it suggests that you really are breaking ties constitutionally with the British monarchy. And remember, I mean, Grenada as an independent state since 1974. Remains part of the Commonwealth. The head of state, effectively, is still the British king, and that just doesn't seem to me to make too much sense. I mean, one of the things that I argue against is the keeping of the post of the Governor General in the island. The Governor General throughout colonialism has represented the monarch. The premises the office of the Governor General is paid for by the Grenadian people. And that's why I call it an anachronism. It doesn't make any sense. I do not see what Grenada benefits from it, particularly when, for example, it is possible for the British Parliament to rule that foreign aid is going to be spent on this rather than that, without necessarily consulting all of the people who are the recipients of and depend upon foreign aid.
There has been a renewed conversation in recent years around decolonization, a renewed public understanding in some cases that decolonization is not over. And that's not just in the former colonies, but also within Britain itself, particularly amongst those who are descended from formerly colonized people. Yet there's an argument to be made that much of this conversation has been within the kind of symbolic realm. You know, it's been around statues, names, and now, you know, who the oath of allegiance is sworn to. Does that go far enough in your mind to actually completing the process of decolonization?
No, I don't think it does. I mean, you will know that recently, within the last 5 years or so, there's this group formed called Heirs of Slavery, right? And one of the BBC's former correspondents, renowned woman, Laura Trevelyan, discovered that her family had been slave owners in Grenada, and went to Grenada, was received with some fanfare by the Grenadian government, and gave them a measly £100,000 as a mark of compensation, apology for what her ancestors did. All right. Well, I mean that's at the more ridiculous end of the argument, as far as I'm concerned. Okay. The most critical thing is this: when the slave owners who owned most of the arable land in the population moved at the end of slavery, the British government compensated them as they did others in Jamaica and Trinidad and Antigua or wherever. People like me, descendants of former enslaved Africans here in Britain, were paying off that debt until 2015. The British government bonded itself to raise £20 million to pay these former owners of enslaved Africans, right? We've been paying back that debt. But when the British moved away from the Caribbean, they left the place pretty destitute, which is why, you know, Professor Hilary Beckles has written extensively about that business. And he talks about the debt that Britain owes the Caribbean and so on. So it's a question of understanding that it's not just a sort of sentimental or emotional stuff about how we relate to Britain. It is really the fact that people's lives are affected by the decisions these metropolitan countries make.
So, I mean, what would material decolonization, particularly within a Caribbean context, look like to you?
It would mean taking care of a number of things, basic things, infrastructural needs that people have, especially given climate change and the dangers that poses for small island states. Shelter, water, food, and especially investing in local agriculture so that they're not importing all kinds of stuff from all over the place. Making sure that the education system equips people for the future, not just in terms of their own individual development, but as people who have the skills and the experience and the qualifications to continue to run the state and provide for the people. Yeah. Now, these are pretty fundamental things.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I have been thinking about quite a lot recently with regards to this question of colonial legacies and the Caribbean is in tax havens, and the fact that so many tax havens are in these what would be called British overseas territories, which essentially are, in a way, not officially colonized in the way that they were, but nonetheless function as extensions of the British state and British capitalism. Could you talk a little bit more about how that financialized relationship exists as a legacy of colonialism that still is very much about moving around the money of elites in particular ways, that continues today in ways that harm both people in the former colonies, but also people within Britain as well, working class people in Britain as well?
I have never really understood how it came about that places such as the Cayman Islands, Grand Cayman in particular, Bermuda, became these tax havens where people could stash away all sorts of wealth, and not have it subject to the same revenue controls, etc., that others might have, whether they be resident or non-resident or whatever. I mean, it creates an imbalance regionally and globally, it seems to me, and it puts out of the reach of governments people who may make the monies by actually exploiting workers in developed and less developed nations, without feeling that they've got to pay anything back to the societies that nurtured them. Now, there is on the one hand tax avoidance, which is illegal, and the kind of tax evasion that many people get up to and is legal. Now, it seems to me that there are two problems with that as far as the Caribbean is concerned. One is that those very people are able to go to places like Grenada or Trinidad or Antigua or wherever, present a package to the government, $200,000 or 500,000 or whatever, which to many of them is pocket change. They'd get rid of that in a casino in one night, for example. Okay, so they present that, and then the government in return gives them access to all kinds of infrastructure, roads, water, electricity, etc., and tax breaks. So the poor people in those places have got to subsidize them because they're coming in to start some business or something or other. Whereas they themselves, those very poor people, find difficulties and are taken to court for not paying their bills. So it's the evils of capitalism in that respect.
I found that interview super interesting because it kind of lays out the way in which that whilst formal colonization has ended, that kind of extractive relationship between Britain, the US, Europe, and the former colonies continues very much to this day. I mean, Micha, if we look at what's kind of the politics in Britain, decolonization, even just colonialism as a term, has gone from being something that has barely been uttered within Britain to being a fairly consistent fixture of the press, educational institutions, art institutions, sometimes in a derogatory way, sometimes not. What do you make of how the British understanding of the impact of colonialism on the world do you think it's shifted? Do you think it's changed? Has it come forward? What do you think about how this decolonization conversation has evolved over the past, let's say, 10 years?
Yeah, I absolutely think it's shifted. I think, as you say, there's kind of used to be this kind of view of colonialism as something that happened in the past and was consigned to the past, and something that was addressed, say, in the Caribbean through the independence movements of the mid to late 20th century. And I think, as both you and Gus pointed out astutely in that interview, decolonization is not a finished process. It's something that's still very much ongoing. And also, there are all these kind of different stratifications of levels of independence. So, for example, removing the head of state, becoming a republic, paying reparations. These are all kind of different stages. So it's not something that's done. And it made me think actually of a quote by Donna Scott Motley, who is a member of the People's National Party in Jamaica, who used this phrase in an interview in The Guardian last year of closing the circle of independence, and the fact that the circle has still not been closed. I also think that previous to maybe this time frame you're talking about of the last 10 years or so, there was kind of this idea that colonialism in Britain, colonialism was something that happened somewhere else. And I think it's quite a different context to, for example, the US, where enslavement and the legacy of enslavement is very current, and you can see the impacts on their own soil. I think because of the situation that we had of colonies of enslaved people in the Caribbean, it was very, or easier, I think, in Britain to kind of separate it as something that happened somewhere else and we don't see the impacts anymore. But I think in the last 10 years or so, we have started to acknowledge that it does continue here, both it continues in the Caribbean, but also on British soil. And that continues, in the form of British racism, as you say, kind of spanning all institutions of society, the curriculum, employment, the economic institutions that have profited from enslavement, the overrepresentation of Black people in psychiatric detention, in the prison system. It's just everywhere. And I think we also saw more conversation about this when the British government finally paid off their debts to the families who enslaved people in 2015. This is very recent history. So yeah, I think also the Windrush scandal gave people more awareness of this as well. The fact that actually the shifting of borders in the aftermath of colonial rule is something that does continually impact Caribbean people on British soil today. And so, yeah, I think that you're right to say there has been this shift in the last 10 years or so to understanding colonialism as something that continues both symbolically, materially, socially, culturally, and I think really importantly, economically.
I feel like there has been maybe a little bit of an over-focus on the symbolism, although I do think that like language and symbols and culture is inherently tied to the material world. It creates culture and language are part of the ways in which we create the possibility for certain material realities. But the press is very much liked to fixate on, should we be singing Rule Britannia at the proms? And that becomes the debate. And what we don't see as the debate is, like you said, those kind of legacies of the fact that, the point of colonialism was not just like gratuitous domination for the sake of it. It was in order to extract resources for almost nothing. It was to protect the movement of some people and inhibit the movement of others. It was to discipline labor. It was to essentially suck the resources from the rest of the world and concentrate it into the hands of a very small number of people. And that continues in the legacy of incarceration, detention, illegitimate debt, the deeply unfair and disordered way in which global resources are distributed. I often say, a lot of the things that people think of as a crisis that exists within the British borders, like migration and global, or like which is rooted in global inequality, people would have a much better understanding of it if they had a genuine understanding of what colonialism is. I mean, do you think that focus on the symbolic has been at the expense of the material? Do you think both have to happen at the same time? And if so, how can we shift it so that it does entail a little bit more of that understanding of how colonialism was a class-making project?
Yeah, I think ideally it wouldn't be either or, but when you were talking, I was just thinking about the ways that the British press loves culture wars stuff, right? They love to frame things as being purely on this kind of battleground of, like you say, do we sing Rule Britannia? And I think that is a risk of also the way that this story could be framed about the oath to King Charles as well. But I think ideally we do want to kind of keep pushing and looking at the material and asking questions like, for example, why are Black people, both in the Caribbean and here on British soil, more likely to live in poverty? That is part of the legacies of colonialism, which continues in the form of British racism. And I think ideally that conversation can happen kind of hand in hand, looking at both the cultural and the material, kind of more economic, because the two also come together. And often those kind of cultural symbols are remnants, legacies of economic, material, historical realities. So yeah, I'm a proponent of looking at both hand in hand and not giving in to kind of the British press's preferred framing of things.
Yeah, I feel like my approach now to that question of like, should they sing Rule Britannia at the proms is like, yeah, they should, because British society does not deserve to not sing Rule Britannia at the proms, because in order to be able to have the appearance of being genuinely free from the legacies of colonialism, you've got to return the wealth. All those formerly colonized nations have to have true sovereignty. And, you know, we have to have genuine wealth redistribution throughout the world. So before that happens, you sing to the world exactly what you are. But I don't know, that's not very pro soundbite position. George Stephanopoulos is a well-known US journalist for US channel ABC, as well as a former Democratic Party advisor. Far less well-known, perhaps until now anyway, is his sister, Mother Agapia Stephanopoulos, who is an Orthodox Christian nun who has spent much of her adult life in the Palestinian town of Bethany in the occupied West Bank. She recently sat down with Tucker Carlson to talk about the impact of Christian Zionism on Palestine. That's the belief held by some evangelical Christians, that Jews must return to the Holy Land to trigger the second coming of Christ. That, by the way, is an apocalyptic event for almost everyone, including Jewish people, with only reborn Christians destined to survive. It was pretty well summed up by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham.
Israel is our friend. They're the most reliable friend we have in the Mideast. They're a democracy, surrounded by people who would cut their throats if they could. This is not a hard choice if you're an American. It's not a hard choice if you're a Christian. A word of warning: if America pulls the plug on Israel, God will pull the plug on us.
I mean, that is just radical religious theocracy in the most blatant form. But what I will say is that when Lindsey Graham says, if the US pulls the plug on Israel, God will pull the plug on the US, he's not entirely wrong. And I don't mean that in the kind of theological sense, you know, let's put that to one side. But in the material sense, in the geopolitical sense, he's not entirely wrong. I think sometimes there is a misconception that the reason that there is this really deep relationship between Israel and the US is because Israel has a really effective lobby. And it does, and that does play a really important role in securing that relationship. But also there is something quite organic about that relationship, in the sense that the geopolitical interests of the US and Israel are genuinely shared. I mean, when you think about like the Middle East and North Africa region, this is an inherently important and strategic region for any global power. Firstly, because obviously it's oil resources, it's oil reserves, oil being, you know, the fuel of the modern world, but also because it exists at this interface between Europe, Africa, and Asia. So anyone who wants to be a global superpower has got to have control over that interface, because, you know, you have these essential waterways. We all saw when the Suez Canal was blocked for a very short period of time, I mean, billions were lost in global capital. And so it is essential, if a country like the US wants to exist in its current form, i.e. as a global superpower, as a hegemon, as a colonial superpower, it has to have that region on lock. that region cannot have sovereignty, because if it has sovereignty, it puts the entire model of the superpower at risk. It puts the geopolitical interest and the ability of that superpower to exist at risk. And so whether it's called Israel, whether it's called something else, the US has to have some kind of ability to hold power in that region. And at the moment, that looks like Israel. And all this stuff around, the Bible, whether it's, what the Bible says, or whether it's, genuine concern for, the presence of a Jewish homeland, all of that is just window dressing for the fact that there is a geopolitical shared interest between the state of Israel and the US. And I mean, I can't remember who said it. I think it might have been Joe Biden, but he said, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to create an Israel. And I think that's probably the most honest thing I've ever heard come out of a US president's mouth. Now, back to the interview at hand. Mother Agapia, who taught at a Christian school in the West Bank, began by describing her life as a Christian in Palestine.
The school I was at has 350 girls. It's in a town that's 98% Muslim. Though it has roots, I mean, it's the roots of where Bethany, where on our school grounds is a stone from the 6th century. This is where Christ met Martha at the resurrection. So we're talking about, and it's the road leading, there's still part of the road that existed when Christ walked during that time and would have seen Lazarus and Martha and Mary. Lazarus's tomb is down the road, right? So permeated even with Palestinian Muslim culture is the sense that Christians lived here, and they recognize Jesus as a prophet, so they respect him and so there's. I'm not saying that everything is perfect. You can't have divisions between, just like even with Christians. Some Christians might think we should have allow politics to be in the church or legislate Christian morality. And others would think totally different. So you can have sort of differences of opinion, if you will, and we can all live with each other between that. So with Muslim and Christian, they can have their differences. But overall, the Palestinian culture is infused with both there.
So you were a nun in a majority Muslim town, a Christian nun,
yep,
in your habit, I assume.
Mm-hmm. And which also was to an advantage because pious Muslims are not jihadists, the ones that I know. I'm not saying other parts of the world that may be the case, but in Palestine, it's simply not the case, or Syria or Lebanon or Iraq. The Muslims that for the most part are, they've all grown up together, the Christians and the Muslims. And there's a certain amount of commonality and respect.
Mother Agapia also talked about the treatment of Christians in Palestine by Israel.
They are not imperiled by Muslims in Palestine. That is an absolute fact. And that's just simply not the case. And again, going back to my school, in our school, we had icons, which are part of the Orthodox tradition, pictures of saints and crosses in every classroom. No problem with that. I could show you a photograph, I can't now, but of the graduates of the latest high school graduation. And, they're embracing the nuns there. They're dressed actually in a more secular way. And it all works
So a lot of
together.
your students were Muslim?
98%. The only Christian
of your students were Muslims?
Yes, yeah. And about half the teachers during the time I was there, some Muslim, some Christian.
In a Christian school?
Yes, and actually that's all throughout Palestine. The Orthodox is relatively small. We do have schools in many of the Palestinian towns, but also Catholic schools, Lutheran schools, and most of the population, most of the students are Muslims.
Huh.
And the beautiful thing about where the great danger is, if the Christians continue to diminish, a key part of Palestinian society and within Israel as well. You go to Nazareth, you'll see many Catholic-run hospitals, schools. And so it's a fabric, it's a part of the whole character.
But I'm just still confused by the idea that the Christian population is declining under Israeli rule.
Yeah.
You would think just the opposite.
What gives them what I observed from my time in Israel and going back every year is that they do not want any Palestinians there. So the majority of Christians in Israel and Palestine are Palestinian. So they have to leave too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth mentioning there that there is not the difference in treatment of Christians in Palestine versus Israel is not due to kind of like the inherent greatness of one religion over another. It's because it's actually nothing to do with religion. It's because one of those societies is a supremacist society, Israel, and the other one is not. Palestine is not a supremacist society. It never has been. It's always been a multifaceted society, whereas Israel is founded upon a supremacist belief. And so you can't then be surprised that that supremacist, ideology turns against people that aren't just people that you secretly believe should be discriminated against anyway, i.e. Muslims. So it's, that, and as someone who, is of an Arab Christian background, what I will say is that when I speak to my relatives, my older relatives in particular, they always say that the divisions began within, in Egypt, in my case, the religious hostilities amongst society began when the country neoliberalized, when the country became tethered to US imperialism, because it is imperialism does not survive without divide and rule. But actually prior to that, it just was simply not fractured and hostile in the way that it might be now. Although I would say it's not nearly as bad as it is presented in the media. But Carlson did go on to ask Mother Agapia why the US allowed Israeli persecution of Christians to continue in Palestine.
So we assume that Christians would be getting an exemption from all this. Why would Christians who are not responsible for Christian terror, there's no such thing, why would they be penalized for this? Why wouldn't they, again, when the patron saint state is majority Christian, why wouldn't the Christians there be getting some kind of special pass? I just don't understand that. Why punish the Christians for Islamic terror?
Because I don't think it's Islamic terror that's taking place in the first place. I think we have to disabuse ourselves of that notion that this is a battle between Muslim and Jew, or that, constantly you heard after the October event was that Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Even to this day, we hear it's Hamas, yes. Hamas, Hamas. What is Hamas? Hamas are people who have had their homes taken from them, who, if they live in Gaza, have not been basically been in an open-air prison for certainly the last 20 years going on. Even when the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, they didn't leave open borders. There was no freedom for people in Gaza to develop their economy. If I know people who wanted to try to go to school in America and couldn't get out of Gaza, had a Fulbright scholarship and weren't able to leave.
What do you mean couldn't get out?
Israel didn't give them permission. So what kind of freedom is that if you live in Gaza?
They couldn't even fly out?
No. And their airport had been bombed in 2000 and early on. 2000, there was an airport built soon after the Oslo Accords. But Israel has intervened many times in Gaza and little by little destroyed. When I first went there in 2002, after the second Intifada started, I remember saying to my mother back home, this is genocide, even that genocide by Chinese water torture. But now we're seeing genocide on steroids.
Despite that record persecution of Arab Christians in Palestine, American churches send millions of dollars to Israel each year. This was Mother Agapia explaining why.
The ones that send money that support the settlements are obviously the Christian Zionists. There's an organization called Christians United for Israel, Pastor John Hagee. I was in Washington a few weeks ago because, they had a conference in Baltimore. So it's slowly growing an awareness by other Christians in America that just like many Jews are protesting and saying, not in our name, and the Jewish Voice for Peace, there has to be much more done by the Christians in America because these Christian Zionists are speaking in our name. Someone like Ted Cruz, Senator Cruz, is saying and doing what he's doing because he's following a Christianity that is not the Christianity of the Holy Land. It's not the Christianity of a Catholic or an Orthodox or a traditional Christian. It's a heretical belief.
What is Christian Zionism?
Mm-hmm. As far as I understand it, they believe in the idea of the rapture. They believe that it's sort of this cruel bargain they have going with Israel, because basically what they say that they're going to be swooped up into heaven right? And then there's going to be a 1,000-year kingdom. And then there'll be the end of the world and the judgment by Christ, and he'll come back. This is a false, it was condemned as a heresy in 381, because basically there is no 1,000-year millennium to come, no 1,000-year period. The end, we are in that time period now. And so it's a false belief there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point in that, to bring up the role of Christian Zionism in this entire conversation, because I was certainly surprised to find out that the biggest pro-Israel lobby in the US is not AIPAC, which is largely Jewish-led, but is actually United Christians for Israel. That is actually the biggest lobby, pro-Israel lobby in the US. And as Mother Stephanopoulos outlined there, churches in the US have been really responsible for a lot of the financial flows, not state-to-state financial flows, but kind of more, let's say, grassroots, I guess, financial flows from the US to Israel, particularly also to those illegal Israeli settlements. I mean, Micha, I wanted to ask you about how not just Christian Zionism, but also the ways in which the violent intolerance of Palestinians is often justified in the West by claiming that they are the ones who are violently intolerant. Do you see what I mean? There's like this strange irony there, that people who are the victims of the most aggressive violence are themselves portrayed as being the source of violence and intolerance. And that seems to manifest quite significantly both around queer communities. You know, this idea of Israel is the safest place for gay people in the region, but also around, you know, the protection of Christians, that in the Muslim world, Christians are so severely persecuted, as if Muslims in the Western world have not been.
Yeah, I was going to point to the same examples, I feel like, you know, around pinkwashing and around the narratives you hear when you see queer people, including myself, you know, speaking up for the rights of Palestinians. You will often online, etc., get responses from pro-Israel people saying, oh, well, do you know what would happen to you if you went to Palestine? Which feels like, you say, it makes the people who are experiencing violence the supposed perpetrators of violence. And it kind of reminds me of this quote by the feminist academic Sara Ahmed, who says this thing about, you know, often the people who point out the problem and resist the problem become the problem themselves. They become rhetorically and ideologically framed as the people often perpetuating the very problem that they are trying to resist. And I do think that that's something that is really happening in this context. And I also think is very much informed by certain manifestations of racism as well. But I think also this thing of Christian Zionism feels like a really important example to talk about when we're thinking about the different ways that Zionism can manifest. Because obviously earlier in the program, we've been talking about this kind of conflation between Jewish people and Israel, or Jewish people and Zionism. But actually, I, you know, when doing this research around Christian Zionism, was thinking about the fact that actually Zionism comes in many, many different forms. And actually, it also points out the way that Zionism in itself can intersect with anti-Semitism. You know, as was pointed out in that interview, the belief that kind of Jewish people should go to Israel to bring about a second coming, during which they will be condemned to hell, is in many ways anti-Semitic. It's kind of instrumentalizing Jewish people for Christian eschatology. And so I think that that's a really important thing to think about in this story as well. And also can kind of be linked to, for example, Arthur Balfour, who made kind of similar arguments that Jewish people should go to a homeland outside of kind of majority Christian societies because he believed that they couldn't assimilate. And so, yeah, I really kind of think that we should think very critically about these conflations between Judaism and Zionism, because we see that Zionism comes in all different forms, from Christians, atheists, from governments. It comes from many different places in society.
People of conscience around the world are continuing to mourn 4 Al Jazeera journalists killed by an Israeli strike in Gaza City. Anas al-Sharif, Mohammed Kreka, Ibrahim Zahir, and Mohammed Noufal were murdered alongside freelance journalists Muamman Aliwa and Mohammed al-Khaldi. The airstrike hit a press tent, drawing condemnation from the UN as a targeted attack on journalists. The UN described the killing as, quote, an attempt to silence reporting on the ongoing genocide and starvation campaign in the besieged enclave. The UN continued to say that the killing of 4 journalists, just as Israel announces its plans to take over Gaza City, is no coincidence, but a deliberate attempt to silence those who would have exposed the IDF's atrocities to the world. Anas al-Sharif was one of the most prominent reporters working in Gaza, having worked almost constantly for the duration of the 2-year war on the Strip. Mohammed Mawad, Al Jazeera's managing editor, described him as the only voice left in Gaza City. Earlier today, I spoke to Laila Al-Arain, an executive producer at Al Jazeera. I began by asking her what the impact of Anas al-Sharif's killing has been on her colleagues at the broadcaster.
It's obviously been extremely devastating to learn about Anas al-Sharif's death and also the death of other colleagues, Mohammed Qriqa, Ibrahim Zahir, Mohammed Nofal, Mu'min Alawa, and Mohammed Khalidi, who was a freelancer. It's important that we say their names and that we tell their stories, because Palestinians at large, and more specifically Palestinian journalists, have been so dehumanized that we can witness Israel repeatedly make threats to their life and to murder and target the largest number of journalists killed in modern history, more than World War I, II, the Vietnam War, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. This has been the deadliest conflict for journalists in our modern history. And the lack of solidarity that we see has a direct result in the endangering of these journalists' lives and also the overall devaluing of Palestinian life. It's been extremely devastating. If Israel can get away with targeting and threatening and murdering the most prominent journalist in Gaza, Anas al-Sharif, what does that say about every other journalist? What does that say about children? Israel has killed the largest proportionally number of children in any conflict in history. Again, proportionally, the largest number of aid workers, of medical workers, of civilians, over 70% at least, are women, children, and the elderly. What that tells you everything about how vulnerable every civilian is in Gaza. And this, of course, will have a chilling effect in terms of the coverage. It is no coincidence that Israel attacked the tent of the Al Jazeera journalist outside Al-Shifa hospital just as it announced that it was expanding its offensive in Gaza City, an offensive that's expected to be just as bloody and just as vicious and brutal as the rest of its assault on Gaza. Anas al-Sharif and his colleagues were the eyes and ears. They were the truth tellers. They told us both on air on Al Jazeera, but also in social media, what was happening to the Palestinian people every day. And without their voice and without their journalism, all of us are suffering as audience members, as fellow journalists, as people who are demanding a stop to this genocide.
There is something deeply unprecedented about this. Journalists typically are a protected category during times of war. What does it mean that Israel has violated this convention, and how has it been able to violate this convention in this way?
Well, let's be clear that this does not begin with this war on Gaza. Israel, as the Committee to Protect Journalists revealed in a 2023 report, has been attacking journalists with impunity for decades. In this very important report called Deadly Patterns, CPJ documented the killing of at least 20 journalists over a period of 22 years, showing that Israel has enjoyed impunity, that Israel has not investigated the killings of these journalists unless it had its back to the wall. Our colleague, Shireen Abu Aqla, an Al Jazeera correspondent in the West Bank, was killed in Jenin, and no one has been held accountable for that killing. You can say the same for the killing of every journalist prior to October 7th. No one is ever held accountable, and the world continues to give Israel impunity in its killing of journalists. Now, of course, since October 7th, Israel has killed upwards of 250 journalists, including a journalist by the name of Assam Abdullah in Lebanon, but also the vast majority being in Gaza, the deadliest place in the world by far for journalists. When The world stays silent when the United States, which is Israel's strongest supporter and enabler of this genocide, allows this to continue with impunity and demanding nothing. All that will do is show the world that killing journalists has no consequence, and that puts every journalist at risk. Every country that decides to target journalists will believe that it will enjoy the impunity that Israel enjoys. That puts all of us at risk. And frankly, the silence of my peers in the media industry has been shameful. Anas al-Sharif himself was tweeting for months, #protect Anas al-Sharif. What did we see in response? Silence, indifference, apathy, and in some cases, the media industry even carrying water for Israel, even after it admitted that it murdered and targeted Anas al-Sharif. What did we see? Despicable media coverage regurgitating some of the very fabricated claims that Israel has been making for months against Anas. And it's not just Anas, it's others.
I kind of want to talk a little bit about the way in which journalists around the world have dealt with what is happening in Gaza right now. Oftentimes, they will kind of hide behind these ideas of objectivity and neutrality. As a journalist yourself, how do you think about the concept of something like objectivity within a context like this, where one side has so much power and the other side has so little, at least institutionalized power?
When it comes to this issue, Palestinians are so dehumanized, and there's so much pressure in the Western media, the legacy media, to adopt the Israeli perspective that journalists simply forget how to do their jobs. The job of a journalist is to report a story out and follow the facts where they lead. Unfortunately, what we've seen for decades, not just since October 7th, but of course it's escalated since October 7th, is for the most part, the legacy media dropping any pretense of objectivity, of doing their jobs as journalists, of reporting stories out, and simply taking the Israeli line, propagating their talking points of the day. And we see that even when it comes to the killing of journalists, of their peers. We see a wholesale adaptation and regurgitation of Israeli propaganda without actually seeing, what is the source of their claims, reporting the claims out for themselves to see where they lead. Palestinians are not asking journalists to be on their side. They're not asking them to be biased. They're simply asking them to do their jobs and do them in a way that's professional and that's leads to the truth.
Are you concerned about how the truth is going to get out of Gaza now that literally an entire team of journalists, of reporters, one of the only functioning organizing teams of journalists in the Strip, have literally been killed?
This is a huge concern. Israel has announced its intention to continue forcibly displacing Palestinians from their homes all over Gaza, squeezing them into a smaller and smaller space. They haven't tried to hide their intentions, and they threatened these journalists for a long time. They've killed so many journalists in order to silence the truth and to silence the coverage. Anas al-Sharif's last live report on Al Jazeera was from a hospital, and his report was focused on the starvation of children. All of these crimes are still happening on a daily basis. An average of 100 Palestinians are being killed on a daily basis. These massacres of people waiting for food aid are happening on a daily basis. And yet the media coverage, both in the Western media, but also even when journalists are being killed and silenced, by its very nature is going to diminish because they are targeting the truth tellers. They are targeting the eyes and ears on the ground. And of course, it's going to have the impact that Israel is intending to have, which is to silence the coverage and to be able to continue committing these crimes in the dark.
Of course, this is not the first time that Israel has assaulted the Gaza Strip. But what is different, and what has been different since 2021, is that there is more of a direct line from journalists and also civilians within the Strip to to the global public, through social media. How has that, do you think, changed the conversation on Palestine? How has that challenged the way that legacy media has traditionally covered Palestine? And what did your colleagues in Gaza make of this shift?
I think in general, people in Gaza feel empowered to be able to bring their voices, their perspectives, their incredible and courageous reporting directly to people through social media. It's not to say that that's the easiest process, because we know that people are being shadow banned on social media, they're being censored, their accounts are being hidden. So that comes with its own challenges. But I think it's been a huge shift in terms of being able to reach audiences directly, and also to challenge some of the entrenched narratives, the biases that we see that are systematic in legacy media. I think what's been incredibly frustrating and depressing for our friends and colleagues in Gaza is that it doesn't seem to have made a huge shift in terms of policy. I don't think anybody in Gaza would have imagined that the genocide would go on for this long, and that even with all of their best efforts in showing people the brutality of the genocide, and let's be clear, every single day they document some of the most brutal, unspeakable horrors that anybody can imagine. I mean, some of the images that we see from there, beheaded people, people shot in the head, people, the bodies of babies absolutely shredded, people turning into skin and bones. These are undeniable. No propaganda campaign can deny these images, even though they try. Something else I've noticed is that audiences, especially younger audiences, are turning away from legacy media because they're saying, if you can't get this story right, you're telling us in your daily reports, whether it's the reports that regurgitate Israeli propaganda, minimize Palestinian suffering, or completely erase the story of Palestinians, how can we believe you on other stories? They see that what legacy media is trying to say is, don't believe your eyes and ears. Don't believe the images and the testimony that you're getting directly from the ground in Gaza. Believe us and believe our narrative and our spin. And I think what that's doing is it's completely undermining audience trust in legacy media as a whole. You're seeing actually these legacy media institutions hemorrhaging audiences left and right, especially young people. They are themselves facing an existential crisis of credibility, of legitimacy, and even of audience retention. So this is going to have a major impact on their credibility long term.
Absolutely. And I mean, I want to end by asking, what do you hope the legacy of your fallen colleagues in Gaza will be going forward? And what can journalists around the world learn from them?
Well, I think we need to listen to the voices of the journalists who remain alive, who are telling us, please don't just talk about us when we've been murdered. Please talk about us right now when we're still alive. No more journalists should be killed and targeted in Gaza. Enough is enough. Enough is enough. The world has to demand that Israel stop targeting journalists, that they stop targeting children, that they stop their killing campaign in Gaza. How much more Palestinian blood has to be shed before Israel is stopped? Enough is enough. And I think there has been a profound betrayal of the media industry, of their own colleagues in Gaza. That has to end now. They must speak up for the protection of journalists, and they must cover this story in a way that they would cover other stories, seeing the humanity of the people who are being targeted and valuing their life. Because what this has done is expose the biases that are so entrenched in our media, but also the censorship and the pressure that journalists face on this issue.
That was Al Jazeera executive producer Laila Al-Arain speaking to me earlier today. Now, Israel has a long history of targeting Palestinian journalists, although this has escalated significantly since the most recent war on Gaza began. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 186 of the 206 journalists killed by Israel since 2001 took place in the past 2 years. Now, unfortunately, as we have come to expect, the response of Western journalists to the killing of their colleagues in Gaza has been disappointing, to say the least. Here's a clip from the BBC.
The accusation from Israel is that Anas al-Sharif had a dual role. He was both, in their words, journalist and terrorist. Have you seen, Yolande, has the BBC seen it or heard any credible evidence that he was participating in the hostilities or acting beyond his role as a journalist?
So the Israeli military basically refers to a trove of documents it says it's uncovered during its operations in the Gaza Strip. They refer to documents where he is supposed to be on the payroll of Hamas, basically. There are a few snapshots of spreadsheets that were put out for journalists to look at, but we're not in any way able to verify them. They show his name on a list where it's supposed to be a phone directory for Hamas operatives in the Gebrial area. Another one where he's on a list of people who were injured as operatives in the year 2023. The BBC understands that prior to the war, Anas al-Sharif was working in the Hamas media office, but that is all that we know about him.
Actually, before I go to the next clip, there's something really, really haunting about seeing that journalist like regurgitating those talking points, the talking points that led to the murder of Anas al-Sharif, on a side-by-side with him reporting from a place where his people are being genocided. It's a little too much. Here is Sky's contribution.
Israel, via the IDF tonight, has issued another statement saying important clarification on Anas al-Sharif. Prior to the strike, we obtained current intelligence indicating that Sharif was an active Hamas military wing operative at the time of his elimination. In addition, he received a salary from the Hamas terror group and Al Jazeera at the same time. What we've presented publicly is only a small declassified portion of our intelligence on al-Sharif leading up to the strike, information obtained during ground operations in Gaza at 2 separate locations, suggesting that the media is ignoring that information. Clearly, other journalists also died in this attack, did they not? And Sharif himself had denied it. Al Jazeera deny it too. So, you're left with two sides here, aren't you?
The cool indifference with which journalists in the West have responded to the killing of their colleagues in Gaza has been a disgrace. The consistent decision to preface every report of a murdered Palestinian journalist with Israeli talking points designed to demonize them and legitimize their killing is not part of a journalistic duty towards objectivity. It is an editorial choice steeped in racism that does not believe Palestinians can be credible narrators of their own lives. Journalists in Gaza are speaking truth to a mighty and ruthless power with little support from the global community, and knowing it puts a target on their back. I have often wondered why Western reporters do not see people like Shireen Abu Akleh and Anas al-Sharif as their peers, and perhaps it's because in many ways they are not. Our legacy broadcasters may be beyond help at this point, but you know what? Maybe the kids are okay. This happened as the BBC broadcast live on A-level results day.
So on that note, I just want to say free Palestine and the genocide, and the BBC is complicit.
All right, we're here to talk about A-level results. All right, thank you for your thoughts. We're here to talk about A-level results today. Gaza, a whole different subject.
Amazing. He's like, we're here to talk about A-level results today. And he's like, I don't think we are. I think we're here to talk about you lot and your complicity in this unfolding genocide. Anyway, thank you, Micha, for joining me tonight. It was a delight to chat to you today.
Thank you for having me, Dalia.
And thank you everyone at home for tuning in. Make sure you come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.